Thank you so much, Sandy. Welcome. My name is Kate O'Brien. I'm Director of Capacity Building at Groundwork USA. So thrilled to have you all here with us. We're very excited to dive into this topic. A little bit first about our, hold on a moment here, okay, about our panelists. So I mentioned myself already, and we also have our guest today, Ilana Preuss from Recast City. She's the founder of that organization. And a little bit about Ilana. She is passionate about making great places and believes that small-scale manufacturers are a missing piece to creating long-lasting, vibrant local economies and great places to live and work for everyone. She has 20 years of experience in city development. She works with local leaders to go from idea to plan to action to build great places. She brings a wealth of experience with federal, state, and local real estate policy, with creating national networks and engaging local elected business and other community leaders to bring projects to life. Ilana is an incredible resource, and I know you will be excited to hear all of her perspective from the field in advancing this kind of work. So we're so excited to have her today. A little bit about the goals for today's webinar. So you'll be hearing a bit about Groundwork USA and our Brownfields Technical Assistance Program. You will be learning about small-scale manufacturing and how it can be an inclusive economic development strategy for your community's toolkit. And we'll be preparing for part 2 of this series happening later in September, which will feature perspectives from small-scale manufacturing entrepreneurs and the practitioners across the country who support them. I just want to touch a bit about Groundwork USA. We're a national organization with local roots in 20 communities across the United States. Our tagline is changing places and changing lives, and our affiliates work to transform vacant, derelict, and contaminated properties for community benefit and spinning off youth and workforce development programming that invests in people alongside those places. We work at the intersection of environment, economy, and equity, and work to build more inclusive and prosperous communities. So there are a few ways that Groundwork USA may be able to help your community. If you're interested at a later time, I encourage you to visit our website, groundworkusa.org. There you'll find information about how to explore the Groundwork model and whether it's right for your community. We have an expanding network of affiliates across the country, and the model may or may not be right for you. We also run a Brownfields Technical Assistance Program. If you're interested, you can request a conversation with members of our team to explore ways to advance your equitable community and economic revitalization agenda around brownfields and urban waterways. And a bit more about our TA program. Our approach is customized, and it builds local sustainable capacity. We are assigned and funded by the EPA Brownfields program to advance equitable development and environmental justice. So we work with you to scope a project that is fitting for your needs, but centers on these focused areas. So designing community engagement strategies that reach beyond those familiar faces who typically show up at planning and visioning meetings, building productive partnerships across sectors, sequencing projects. So the kinds of revitalization projects, particularly around brownfield redevelopment, take many, many years. And so there are certain things you can do early on to build momentum and advance outcomes over the long term by engaging people in the near term. So really focusing on action planning and getting people to cooperate and do their business differently to share the reins of leadership and advance a more equitable, inclusive revitalization agenda. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ilana, who is going to talk a bit about small-scale manufacturing and tell us about what it is and what it might look like on the ground.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I'm going to, oh, look, I can now move the slides. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. As Kate explained, I come to you with a long background in community redevelopment. I worked in city planning in smart growth for the last 20 years, really focusing on the small p politics, which isn't really small p, of how do we make a place really vibrant for the people who live there. Some places need reinvestment of different types. We look at housing choices, we look at transportation choices, but too infrequently we look at what kinds of businesses are there in the community and how those businesses are both from the people in the community and can benefit the people in the community, so that as economic development or business development occurs within the community, that it actually is inclusive of the residents in that community. A number of years ago, I started looking into the role of different kinds of small businesses and came across the world of small-scale manufacturing. And what I'm going to do today is really walk you through a couple of definitions so that we're all starting on the same basis, and then really have a discussion with you about how do we do this in a way that establishes an inclusive economic development opportunity. Because I do think that as much as small-scale manufacturing is not the answer to everything, it is this missing piece that we haven't thought about, and it's coming through in different ways from the way we've thought about manufacturing in the past, so that it can be a great asset for all different size neighborhoods, cities, towns, and counties. So let's see, arrows, don't see arrows. Here we go. So small-scale manufacturing. Yeah, I got it. Small-scale manufacturing is anytime we're making a good. Think about any kind of tangible good that you can have made. It might be something that's made directly to or for consumers. So this is a chocolate making business that's in Cincinnati, Maverick, an amazing, amazing chocolate business. This is small-scale manufacturing. We can also think about people working in textiles. This is small-scale manufacturing, right? And if we think about manufacturing, this is really modern manufacturing. And we need to think about this modern definition, which is production that doesn't make noise, and it doesn't make any kind of strong smells, and it's a great neighbor. And most of these businesses are actually quite small across our country. They have fewer than 20 employees, and that means that they can fit into our neighborhoods in ways that we never really thought about manufacturing fitting into our neighborhoods before. And we also know that they, for the most part, are congregating in cities, all different size cities and towns, because they want to be near other producers. And they lend themselves really to being able to build a community of businesses and a community of consumers around them. But when we think about small-scale manufacturing, we really need to have this expansive definition of what is included. It includes breweries and distilleries. It includes space where a business can both do their production and have a retail space all in one open space. It includes hardware fabricators. And so we really have to think about businesses going from one person, which in some communities might be called an artisan or maker business or craftsperson, all the way up to 20-person and in some cases 50-person businesses where they can still fit into the scale of the businesses in our neighborhood or in our downtown. And that scale is going to be dependent on each community. But it gives us this great asset of being able to bring people together. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit before I get into the details, because from my work, I established Recast City just under 3 years ago, I've had an opportunity to work with cities big and small from across the country, counties, real estate developers, local nonprofits, foundations. And what we're finding is that the more we can keep small-scale production businesses within the neighborhood, the stronger that local economy is, but also the stronger that neighborhood is, because we're keeping jobs in close proximity to where people live. And we know from tons of research that's already out there, when people live closer to jobs, they have a greater opportunity of having those jobs and having better paying jobs. And so there are a few trends that I want to go through very briefly. One is that we've had this trend for a while looking at self-employment. There are some people who say it started because of the downturn in the economy a bunch of years ago. Some people say that this is also based on access to health care outside of, as an independent business. But this is important because we have a whole generation of individuals who see that self-employment is not necessarily a high-risk venture, and people are willing to go this route. We also have this crazy thing called a maker movement. I don't know how many people have been to a maker fair or been to a place called a maker space where you can get at tools as part of a membership or a class. But the maker movement has been around for over a decade, and it is all about educating people about making stuff again. And yes, this is a fire-breathing snail. This is all about how do we show both the youth of today and the adults that there are great tools out there, there's great business models out there to be able to make stuff again. And what it's really done is that the maker movement has matured over its years of being around, in that lots of businesses are starting to come out of the maker movement. So we know that there are all of these small-scale businesses. They're producing some kind of tangible good. And when I say it specifically that way, because we are material agnostic, right? This is wood, metal, textile, hardware, food production, any kind of food that could be packaged and sold, anything that you can make and replicate. They are on average 20 or fewer people. We know that the barrier to entry is much lower than it used to be because of the internet, so you can sell nationally and internationally overnight. And for the most part, these businesses are sourcing their materials locally as much as they can because they are also very focused on their own community, and they're paying higher wages. These businesses are paying 50 to 100% more than retail and service jobs. And so when we're talking about how do we make sure that we're retaining middle-income, living wage jobs in our community, this might be one of the key ways for us to do this. There are tons of online platforms for folks to both sell their product, but also for people who are designing items to be able to work with contract manufacturers. So all of a sudden, if there's a contract textile manufacturer or a machine shop in your community, they can access designers who are looking for people to make a widget, a piece, a something, and they can get a stronger connection to designers all over the country because of that as well. And there are a couple of assets for us to think about as to why we're pursuing this, right? One is that the people are the amenity. And I know that sounds a little funny, but these businesses have a great ability to attract people. They are often selling their products online or directly to other businesses through wholesale, which means that they're not dependent on foot traffic, although they may be very happy having it. And so they can be the first in a neighborhood or on a corridor that might need some attention and might need some businesses in it, but may not have enough foot traffic really to support retail yet. So these businesses can be first in. Additionally, especially the consumer-facing small-scale manufacturers are a great basis for markets. They can complement an existing farmer's market. You can organize festivals around local producers, and it helps bring people together. And we know from tons of research, there's great research from Soul of the Community, which is analysis of cities in the South and Midwest, asking people why they stayed in those communities. And the fact that the community was inclusive, had places to gather, and had some sort of aesthetic beauty were the three main factors that they found that tied people to the places that they lived. And so places to gather, right, having festivals, having places where people want to gather is a key part of that. We also know that small businesses strengthen our economic resiliency. But we know specifically that small-scale manufacturing businesses, as I said, pay better than retail and service jobs and help provide these missing middle-income jobs and keep them within our community and within our neighborhoods. And they create an opportunity for us to establish inclusive economic development outcomes when we're thinking about individual neighborhoods and how we work with them and the businesses that people might have in their home that could end up being in a storefront if they receive adequate economic development or business development support. We know when we look more, this is a more expansive view, looking from Brookings at advanced industries, that the wages, with or without college degrees, you will make more money with advanced industries, and this is inclusive of small-scale manufacturing. And then there's the great passion around local power. San Francisco is fantastic at harnessing this and provides tons of services to small-scale manufacturing businesses in their community, but people really do love buying products from individuals within their neighborhood, in their city, and are very proud of it. So there are a couple of opportunities when we're thinking about the connection between these businesses from a business development opportunity as well as from a placemaking opportunity, right? These businesses are a tenant type that we haven't thought about. They can go into storefronts, they can go into older retail spaces, they can add a diversity of tenant types to our real estate. They often are very happy going into older buildings. They're new users for our older buildings. And as I said, they bring people out for events to see this production. The more we watch retail, and lots of people are writing about, how retail is dying, how it's changing, the experience of retail is the thing that everyone keeps talking about, how people want to experience something about it. And being able to watch somebody make something and seeing their tools is a huge attraction for people to be able to walk by and see production happening. And then, obviously, it allows us to grow and keep more businesses and good jobs in our towns, in our neighborhoods, and in our cities. So who are these businesses? I'm just going to give you a few examples really briefly. One, there are shared business spaces. So this might be a shared kitchen, a shared commercial kitchen, a shared wood shop, a shared textile space. This is a space that is furnished with the tools, and the small businesses can pay to use the tools for a set period of time. It's not open to the public. A shared commercial kitchen is probably the thing that is most popular growing across the country right now, so that a food truck or somebody who's creating a packaged hot sauce or pickles, they will go to the shared commercial kitchen. They'll pay to use a stamped health department approved commercial kitchen for a set number of hours. They'll package their goods and then they leave and somebody else uses it. It's a great way to create space for these businesses, and businesses can grow out of it. There are a number of them that are also very focused on minority and Latino business owners, like La Cocina in San Francisco and Commonwealth Kitchen in Massachusetts. There are also for-profit commercial shared kitchens in different cities that are also mission-driven but more broad in their outcomes. Then there are maker industries, craftspeople, artisans, pick a name and stick with it. These are businesses that are anywhere from 1 to 3 people. This is Katie Stack, who's in Washington, D.C. She works in a space that's 450 square feet where she does her production and she does her retail sales out of that space. She sells online individually to consumers, and she's expanding into wholesale. She's about to move into 1,000 square feet. She's gone from 1 employee to, I think, 4 employees now. This is how we see these maker industries start out and then grow. And those are important within our community. And then we have businesses that are scaling, prototyping to small-scale production, right? These can be in 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 square foot spaces, really up to about 20,000 square feet, depending on the community and the scale of the buildings that you're working with. They can be Shinola, which is on top, for watch manufacturing. They can be drones. It can be hardware and technology-based. It can be breweries and distilleries or it can be textile work, screen printing shirts, woodworking at scale for cabinetry. All of these are different versions of small-scale manufacturing, and they can be embedded within our neighborhoods. And as I said before, but I will repeat it, it really is an amazing way to both grow and keep businesses and good jobs within our neighborhoods and within our towns. So the topic for conversation today is really twofold. One, how do we create it? And I can talk about that a little bit. And two, how do we make sure we're doing it in an inclusive way? Because manufacturing, particularly the ownership of manufacturing businesses, has predominantly been white owners. And when I work with different cities, there's often a separation of programming to work with minority business owners, Latino business owners, and people don't always make the connection between what they think of as or describe as lifestyle businesses, so a business that might be making lotions and potions, candles, hair products, and which are all small-scale manufacturing, with businesses that are doing hardware or breweries or textiles. And we end up creating these false divisions between businesses that don't need to be there because most of these businesses that need capital for equipment, need capital to buy raw products that they're using, they're all facing similar challenges. And the differences are in scalability, interest to scale, and access to capital, depending on what background the person has, what they're looking for. And a lot of these businesses, when I do interviews with them along the way, they talk about how they got their first loan for the first big piece of equipment because they could take out a line of credit on their home, or their parents could take out a line of credit on their home, and that's how they could afford it. Well, when somebody doesn't have that kind of friends and family or personal access to capital, that's a big barrier. So one of the questions that I want to make sure that we're addressing is how do we create this inclusive economic development opportunity? And it's, in many cases, the simplest and the starting point in every community is the outreach. Who's doing the outreach? How are you identifying existing business owners within your community that represents the demographics of your community? And that's really hard in a lot of communities because the people who traditionally have been doing the economic development work and the business development work in the community may not have the established personal networks to reach across all of the different communities, the immigrant populations. There might be language barriers, there might be cultural or racial barriers, and building up that personal network, as we know in the business community, is probably the most important first step. So Kate, oops, I hit the wrong button. Do you want me to walk through some of these sort of steps of this? Do you want to take some questions?
Sure. I think we can do both of those simultaneously. And I was remiss in saying this at the beginning of the webinar, but I encourage any and all who are listening and watching today, please use the Q&A box and type in your question. We will be monitoring that and can answer your questions kind of on the fly. We may collect them up and gather them in bundles. But Ilana, I love your framing and the introduction. It was really wonderful to kind of get our minds wrapped around what small-scale manufacturing looks like, and I appreciate this expansive definition and thinking about infill, reusing spaces that may be sitting there underutilized in our communities. And, when we talked in advance of this webinar today, we were prepping and thinking about the terrain we could cover. We talked about how small-scale manufacturing could be an economic development strategy. And in particular, one thing that stood out to me in our conversation was how it seems to be maybe missing from the municipal, toolbox, or maybe not something conceived of as an economic development strategy. I wonder if you might talk and unpack a little bit some of these, benefits specifically and some competitive advantages that maybe some older former industrial cities and brownfield-affected communities may have for encouraging small-scale manufacturing.
Sure. I'll talk about a couple different pieces there. One is that traditionally economic development at the local level has a couple different parts. There are a number of different theories at the local level. Old school economic development is really all about chase the smokestacks. How do we give the big tax incentive, the big tax break to some big corporation to come here, hoping that the spin-off effect of their employees spending money in our community is going to be enough to make a difference for the tax break that we give them. There's a lot of research, including wonderful work from Good Jobs First, that shows that that's really not an effective way to bring economic development to your community. There's also a whole theory around it called economic gardening, which suggests that if you find people in your community who are already entrepreneurs, already business owners, and help them scale and expand their businesses, that those are businesses that will stay in your community, they've already put down roots in your community, and that those businesses will hire people who live locally and will be owned by people who live locally. And that's a lot of the basis of this. The added nuance is that these small-scale manufacturers, they pay better than retail and service jobs. And so a lot of times when we look at small business programs within different cities and counties, they often skew much more towards restaurants, bars, retail, and service. And it's mostly because I don't think anybody's thought about manufacturing for a really long time, or because we've never thought about small-scale manufacturing as being able to fit into a retail corridor, because nobody thinks of manufacturing at that scale. And so the important part is to really think about what is there in the community at that scale. And in a lot of cases, that means doing things like looking at who is selling in a farmer's market that isn't selling food. There are all sorts of food producers that often are selling in a local farmer's market. Are there people in the community that are selling on Etsy? You can do a search on Etsy by location, at least by city, I think. And so you can see who within your city is selling on Etsy. And what you'll find in most communities is that the small-scale manufacturers know each other. They don't necessarily know everybody across all the materials, but if you find one person who works in wood, they'll be able to tell you about 5 others. If you find one person who works in food production, they'll be able to tell you about 5 others. And depending on the community, they might be more established within a more insular neighborhood than another. I'll give you an example. I did a project in Fremont, California. Fremont is amazing. Their economic development director is completely ahead of the curve on this, and gets that they have large manufacturing, but that they need to build this pipeline of small and medium-sized manufacturing businesses. And they actually have a ton of them once you start digging in, sort of hidden in pockets all over the city. And they're often people who are engineers who are building their own equipment and figuring out how to make just the right product for themselves. But what they found is that they also have an Afghani community that they hadn't had a chance to reach out to yet. And they didn't have the existing personal relationships within that community. And so it identified for them that they needed to start from scratch to build relationships within that business community, because there were definitely existing small-scale manufacturing business owners in that community. They just didn't know them. And so to find out even who those businesses are, they needed to be able to build those relationships. And I want to make sure that we're identifying different categories, right? I think about it being inclusive in identifying business owners versus how are we helping launch a more diverse set of entrepreneurs within the community. And identifying existing business owners and helping them scale is to me the lowest hanging fruit. These are people who are already established some kind of business. It might be home-based, it might have a bricks and mortar, they might share a space with somebody. But these are people who have already figured out a product and they've already figured out how to sell it to somebody. And so helping them figure out how to become a more resilient business or scale their business to some degree is a specific set of steps. That is where I would start in every community. And then secondarily, there are great programs out there like E4All, which started in Massachusetts and is now looking to go nationally, that identifies people who are entrepreneurial but who may not have had the exposure to business development program. They might have language barriers to the existing entrepreneurship program. They may not have access to capital, and so they're working on breaking down those barriers. Or Mortar, which We Are Mortar is another great program that is specifically looking to reach out to people who are African American in their community in Cincinnati to help train those entrepreneurial people to become entrepreneurs. So there are great examples of that, but remembering to start at the place of identifying a truly inclusive group of business owners within the community is going to be an important starting place.
Yeah, it comes back to being all about the relationships, right? It's, providing exposure, networking opportunities. It's not rocket science, right? And it's funny how it keeps boomeranging back to this concept that it's about reaching out beyond your familiar, right?
Right. And it really comes down to finding, I'm going to guess anybody who's part of Groundworks already knows this, but this is something I really repeat wherever I go. It's finding the trusted leader within that community who can make introductions. Because if you don't have those personal relationships within a community, you're very likely going to need somebody to make that introduction for you. And it doesn't matter what that different community is, what the division or the barrier is. There's most likely trust issues that are inherent in that barrier. And so finding a faith leader and a business owner or different community, other kinds of community leaders who you can sit down over a cup of coffee and talk about this with and ask them their advice and ask them for introductions is going to be a really important way to do it. And I think in our day and age, a lot of people rely too much on an email or a phone call, where this kind of relationship building really needs to take a place over a cup of coffee or a meal, because it's really about building trust across communities from scratch. Yes.
I'm reviewing a question coming in from Boston. There's sort of an offer of an example that Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corporation in Boston has built 2 factories and a third with the New Market Business Association, which is now trying to expand on the 250-plus light manufacturing businesses with upwards of 20,000 working-class jobs as being key to preventing displacement. Wondering if there are other experiences or comparable scenarios that might come to mind as you think about that.
They're doing an amazing job up there. They're the ones that also did the Commonwealth Kitchen project. So folks should definitely look at the models that they're creating. I'm trying to think. I think Lowell is also Lowell, Massachusetts, in that area. They have a large Cambodian and Latino community in the city, and they're really being quite proactive to engage with those community organizations, both to provide workforce training and to figure out the real estate side of this. Because part of the challenge, especially with small-scale manufacturing, is that they can go into, if you clean up a brownfield site with an older building on it, they're a great business to go into a brownfield site, right? A lot of these businesses love the funky old industrial buildings that may never be able to be residential because of cleanup issues. But a lot of times, as you have small-scale manufacturing get established in a neighborhood, the neighborhood becomes cool. And so then the small-scale manufacturers get priced out of the neighborhood. And this is a key role for city government or community development corporations or land banks to serve, because you need to think about how do we think about affordable workspace for our own local businesses long term. From my perspective, these businesses deserve the similar set of tools like we have for affordable housing. I see affordable workspace for local businesses as a public good. How are we keeping businesses owned by our own neighborhood residents within the neighborhood? How are we keeping our own community? How are we keeping people in the community in affordable housing? Those are both public goods to me. And so communities like Knoxville are trying to think ahead to figure out, well, before a neighborhood gets really hot, what are we going to do in advance of it? What's the role of the CDC? What can the city do around this? And ownership of the property is really a key part of this. So in St. Louis, there's a partnership between a local community development corporation, the Riley Area Development Corporation, and a local nonprofit called St. Louis Makes, which is a nonprofit working to build up the small-scale manufacturing community that's actually quite strong in St. Louis. Just most people don't know it's there. And they're partnering together on a building, a 6-story building. I think it's 80,000 square feet. That's a manufacturing building that had actually been in continuous use up until last year, and they are going to be rehabbing it and subdividing it for a bunch of small-scale manufacturers to be able to share a building so that they can look at how do we ensure that we're providing some affordable workspace and that community of businesses, as well as programming for businesses. In their case, they're focusing on businesses that want to scale, all on site in this building. And so that's going to be, I think, an increasingly important role for community development corporations to think about.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of questions that have come in that are sort of similar, so I might lump them together a little bit. So there's, the places like you mentioned, Lowell, and several other examples of places that are creating sort of safe spots, resource spots for diverse sets of entrepreneurs using a very grassroots style, so doing on-the-ground outreach, using word of mouth, targeting key neighborhoods, and working with partners that have strong constituencies of folks. So an example of the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association in Lowell, for instance, to reach the Cambodian population there. And I guess there's another question that's related, services we're talking about cultivating these spaces to counteract or perhaps prevail over these, tendencies to kind of cluster and intermingle with our own kind, right? Not reach beyond our zones of comfort or zones of familiarity, and reaching across cultural and racial and ethnic lines, perhaps, to find and support entrepreneurs. If you are approached by a community, I suspect in your line of work, you may be approached by communities that maybe they don't have that kind of a resource center. They don't have that grassroots, that E4All or that mortar type place. How would you recommend that community, if it's a municipality, to get started in establishing something like that or supporting something like that? And then I guess along with that question, what sorts of spaces sputter and don't take off, and are there common mistakes or things to avoid as you're thinking about starting up and intentionally supporting small-scale entrepreneurs?
Sure.
That's a lot of questions.
I will try to, if I don't answer all of them, please just remind me which ones I still need to hit. Lots of places do not have existing entrepreneur programs in town. That's true in a lot of places, especially when we're looking at rural communities. But a lot of places do have a community college that might have this programming or the opportunity to add this programming and open it up to a community. So I would think about where you might have assets that you might not have thought of before. That being said, in a community, I've worked in communities that have never done anything on small-scale manufacturing before, and it all starts with making a list. How do you go about making a list of existing small-scale manufacturers in your town, in your city, in your county? You look at people who are selling things at any kind of farmer's market. You look at, like I said, on Etsy. In rural towns, I've been told you ask the post office, the person who runs the post office, because they know everybody's business. People who are making products at home, tons of it is word of mouth at the beginning. And what you'll find is if you can find 10 people who are making stuff, you'll find the next 10 and the 10 after that. But what I have found in most communities is that if the economic development lead is a white person, they may not know the right person to ask to find the business owners who are Latino or African American or in the immigrant population, even if it's a resettlement community. And so if there aren't established organizations like Goals Cambodian organization, then finding faith leaders or different any kind of organization that might be there, or just working through any kind of personal network to make your way into that community. It is grassroots in its most rootness. I don't know how else to describe it. It is really all about going out and building personal relationships for the sake of economic development within the community. There is no shortcut way of doing it. And the key is to finding somebody who knows other people if you don't. And just keep pushing and asking about that. The spaces question. I think that maker spaces are really hard to pull off. And so maker spaces, just to remind everybody of the definition, is this is a space that is open to the public, has a set of tools for use, either through classes and or through membership that people pay. It can be mission. There's a great one in Detroit, in a neighborhood in Detroit, I think it's called Mount Elliott, that's all about employing adults from the neighborhood, training kids from the neighborhood, and showing them that they have this ability to think in these creative problem-solving ways. Don't tell them it's engineering, but it's actually engineering, right? How do you figure out how to make something with duct tape? You know, you're building something with duct tape, all of a sudden you're trying to engineer something. And how do you use cheap materials like duct tape to make something before you're working on wood or metal, or even with an Arduino board and technology? How do we make it as accessible as possible? There's great mission-driven ones. The ones that have been working, I think, the best from the makerspace side are ones that are nonprofit and are super mission-driven in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Some of them are focused on youth education. Some are focused on workforce development. Who are the partners you have to have in from the very beginning for those programs to work? There's one big for-profit makerspace called Tech Shop. They're only working in partnership with universities and other major anchor institutions to establish and manage larger makerspaces. But even they started with these huge makerspaces and are scaling them back. There are some community foundations that have gotten involved with makerspaces. There's a great community foundation in Baltimore called the Deutsch Foundation, and they are supporters of a nonprofit arts development company called Barco, the Baltimore Arts Realty Corporation, Barco. Barco developed a makerspace that's 34,000 square feet in Baltimore called OpenWorks. It only opened less than a year ago, and their focus is both on youth education and workforce development, but also to be there as a resource to the arts students graduating from the arts college that's nearby, so that they have access to tools once they graduate and can develop businesses out of it. So being really specific about the mission and the outcomes and those funding sources. I think that, I don't know if this is true, but I would think there are very few makerspaces that have figured out the business model to be profitable yet. It's still a very new world of spaces. That being said, there have been development of these shared buildings now for 20 years. They've been formally like this, informally like this, but subdividing a larger building for a bunch of small-scale manufacturers. The first ones that I know about doing it were in Brooklyn, called Greenpoint Manufacturing and Design Center. There's the folks in St. Louis that I mentioned as well. There's folks in Indianapolis and Baltimore. There's a lot of different CDCs that are looking at redeveloping the existing buildings for it to be shared by a bunch of small-scale manufacturers, because they recognize this need for an operational move-in space that is affordable. And so I think that's going to be a really important part of it. And the other thing to think about in that, both from the brownfield vacant property side, as well as how do we retain the affordability of space longer term, is I think we have to remember also that historically, one of the ways that we broke cycles of poverty within our community was that a business owner that was moderately successful could buy their building. They could buy their building, they could work in their building, and they often could have an apartment upstairs or out back. And so I think we have to think about how do we bring that model back. We don't want people who don't have enough capital or enough success, we don't want them risking it all on a property. But if businesses can get in early in a neighborhood and buy a property, well then when the neighborhood increases in value, that business owner has the option of selling their property and being able to reinvest that equity either in their business or in their family, and really changing the storyline in our communities. And it's something that we saw in immigrant populations, over history, but something that I think we have to remember to bring back. And Pittsburgh is, in my opinion, really leading the way on that.
Mm. That's really incredible perspective. Thank you for that. I know that we've talked a lot about cities here, and there is a question about if you have any examples that might work for rural areas or a more rural context. And I'm cognizant we have just under 10 minutes left, and there's one other question after that I have on deck here. So okay. For now, any examples that may focus on rural, and then get to this final question.
So this definitely works in rural, there's no doubt. It takes leadership, like in any other community. The difference might be that the right square footage of a use space might be 1,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet, because it might have one major crossroads, right, with 10 or 20 buildings, and that's the center of the rural town. But it's a great way to build jobs within the community for the community, because those small-scale manufacturers in the rural community aren't going to be dependent on selling just to the people in the town. They're going to be able to sell wholesale online, and so they might need that kind of assistance in figuring out how to connect to distributors versus having an issue of affordable space in the community. And so you need to talk directly with small-scale manufacturers in your community, in your region, and understand what those challenges are. There's one community that I gave a talk in Oregon called Talent, Oregon. I think their population is under 5,000. It might be 2,000 people. I don't remember. But their mayor recognized that this was important for their community, and wanted to really think about where these businesses could locate in the center of their small town. Not too far away from there is Grants Pass, Oregon. There are 30,000 people, but they're the town in the middle of a rural area. Their downtown is more like 12 square blocks, but they had small-scale manufacturers who were not only in town, but doing a bunch of small-scale manufacturing out of their homes in the larger parts of Grants Pass and in the county around it. And so part of the question was, how do you encourage these small-scale manufacturers actually to become part of the empty storefronts that are in downtown? They have a large Latino population that's very divided from the center city. So how do you encourage those business owners to connect up in one area in downtown and really bridge those gaps in the community to create that inclusive business community? So it's very much possible and a reality in rural communities as well.
Yep. Great. Thank you. So the other question I have here, one other came in that's interesting and also intertwined here. I guess this is a question, and it seems like maybe with this kind of will wrap up our discussion nicely and set us off for part 2. Is this around changing hearts and minds, particularly of local government people, to support how to change those hearts and minds, how to convince local governments to support entrepreneur gardening, as the phrase was mentioned. So in other words, how can we encourage local government to incentivize local entrepreneurs first, rather than only looking outside the community and working to attract new businesses or new entrepreneurs in? So sort of doing the homegrown approach first. And I guess I wonder if you might have thoughts on, is there foundational information that might be useful to kind of start this conversation with municipal government? I suspect that networking across institutions and across local government is challenging, of course. Is there a way that you might suggest kind of inoculating the types of thinking about this and prioritizing those core values of let's look here at home in our backyard first?
Yes. I think you have to find the right local champion. I think that is very true. And it may not come from your local economic development authority. I think oftentimes elected officials get this idea and this outcome more intuitively than somebody who's been working in economic development for a long time, because it is a different idea. It's a new idea. And so I've seen leadership from planning departments, from economic development departments, from mayors' offices directly, and from the real estate community directly. And so I think understanding who that leader is in the community is an important part of it. I think in some cases, having the small-scale manufacturing businesses start to organize themselves is going to be a key part of it. One of the ways that a community can really put their toe in the water is to fund work on this. So, for instance, Baltimore got a grant from the U.S. Economic Development Administration to create a Made in Baltimore position. It's half funded by the city and EDA, and because that person can focus on that with most of their time, they have the opportunity and the time to go build those personal relationships. And they just had a launch party that was this amazing, diverse celebration of the small-scale manufacturing business community that is in Baltimore, that unless you had somebody really knitting together those relationships, you wouldn't really have. So, I think that there are many different roles that community governments can take, but it may not be the community government that leads it. It might be a foundation, a community foundation. It might be a corporation that understands that they're in a smaller city or town and they're having a hard time keeping their executives or recruiting people, and they need more of a cool factor. Well, maybe they'll put money into an entrepreneur program and help identify storefronts for these businesses to go into, because we know from tons of research that folks are looking for a place that they can hang out, and they want that kind of street life. And so I think you have to think sometimes creatively about who that leadership is going to come from. There are plenty of models out there like E4All or Mortar, or the program that Rev Birmingham does using the Co-Starter program to really help entrepreneurs identify their business plan, vet a product or a plan, and really be ready to get off the ground. But I think that we have to, as a community, think about not only the folks getting off the ground, but those businesses that are already there. Those are really the ones that I would go after first and figure out how do we help them scale and where are they going. Because traditionally when we thought about small-scale manufacturing or manufacturing in general, historically we thought about the far edges of our community because they had negative impacts on our community. But these are businesses that can be a great benefit to our community. They can be such an amazing asset to energy and pride and jobs with good living wages that we want to keep them close and to think about that placement really carefully in terms of where we want them within our community as a key part of that as well.
Mm-hmm. You've given us so much great food for thought. Thank you so much, Ilana. I know you've fielded questions from all over the place, all corners of the country. I wanted, if you've signed up today for the webinar, know that you're on our distribution list. We promise we won't spam you, but we will send you an update about part 2 of our webinar series here, focused on encouragement of small-scale manufacturing in brownfield-affected communities. Our target date is mid to late September. We've been hovering around Wednesdays, but midweek in general, right around this time. So stay tuned to your email for part 2. If you like what you heard today, please join us again. You also may visit our website. You can find out more about direct technical assistance and other avenues for engaging with us. In particular, if you're in the business of changing hearts and minds and cultivating leadership and entrepreneurship, we'd love to support you. I know Ilana would love to support you, so feel free. You can find her at ilana@recastcity.com. She's also an active tweeter, so you can find her on social media and Facebook as well. Thanks so much for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you virtually again and hope to meet you soon sometime in the field. Take care, everyone. Thank you.